All right, we find ourselves in chapter 6. All right, we find ourselves in chapter 6, which is about bone. Now, what we'll do in our videos for this chapter is we'll do kind of a brief overview of the skeletal system. You'll talk primarily about that portion while you're in lab. We will go through the actual structure of bone, paying particular focus to the long bones. That's kind of the standard bones that we think about. And then we'll really move on into the physiology. How do bones develop, right? How do they grow? How do they change maybe during your lifespan? A little bit about bone physiology, which I hope you'll find actually pretty intriguing, the fact that the skeleton is basically constantly remodeling itself. And then the very end of the chapter talks a little bit about when things go wrong. What happens when a bone breaks? Is our body able to fix that? Okay, so thinking about the skeleton, right? This is kind of this dried up body. When you see a skeleton and there's no flesh and skin and things like that attached, you're just looking at the bones, the cartilage, the ligaments that kind of make up the structure of the body. But it's important to realize that bone is actually alive, right? In lab, you are learning these 206 bones that have been named, as well as a lot of their features. I love this stuff. If you have any questions about those bones or their features, feel free to come by and see me during office hours, make an appointment. I would love to go over that with you. Okay, so here we go. Bones are organs, right? Remember, when we talk about organs, we were talking about multiple different tissue types working together for some purpose. Now, they're primarily that osseous connective tissue, which don't worry, we'll talk a lot about, but realize that bones have nerves in them, right? It hurts when you break a bone. We talked about hyaline cartilage in the tissue chapter. That's going to be the cartilage that covers the ends of the bones, right, where they meet at an articulation. We find other connective tissues. There's a rich blood supply in bone, so these blood vessels have muscle, right, smooth muscle in the blood vessels, as well as epithelial tissues. And then actually the center, particularly of the long bones, is hollow. It's a medullary cavity, and at least in adults, that's filled with adipose, with fat, right? So we're actually looking at a lot of different tissues that make up this organ that we call a bone. And again, they're not dead, that's just the way you see them at Halloween. Okay, so again, in lab, I know you're learning a lot of these bones. For me, you do want to understand that we split the skeleton, and I believe this is very much how your sheets in lab are done, into the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So for me, you should know that the axial skeleton refers to kind of what's highlighted in blue here, right? The skull, the vertebral column, and what we call the bony thorax, right? The ribs, the sternum, that area that makes up the thorax, right? Its main roles, we're thinking about things like support and protection, right? The skull, the vertebrae, the ribs, those are all protecting very important organs. And then the appendicular skeleton, these are the limbs and their girdles. So the shoulder girdle, like the clavicle and the scapula, as well as the upper limb, the arm, right? And then the pelvic girdle, as well as the legs. So everything kind of in tan there. That function, way less about protection, though I would argue that the pelvic girdle does have some role there, but this is primarily about movement. So when you think of the skeleton, right, maybe that's something to think about here. What is the actual function of these bones, right? And here we definitely see support, right? The skeleton is what holds us upright. It provides a site of attachment for the skeletal muscles. Many portions, right, of the skeleton Many bones are involved in the protection of vital internal organs, right? Your skull is an amazing little helmet to protect your brain. You should still wear a helmet on top of it. And then this one we think of a lot, this idea of movement, right? So the skeletal muscles are attached to these bones, and they actually act as levers. If you've ever taken a physics class where they talk about maybe how you gain this mechanical advantage, it's pretty remarkable if you look at the way the bones actually change kind of the pull of the muscles on these bones to produce movement. Other things that we should probably think about as far as function. Blood cell production. Both red blood cells and white blood cells are actually produced in red bone marrow. So, and you've probably heard of bone marrow before, kind of at the center of these bones. And so this is a really important function, the site of blood cell production. Another function we mentioned that any of that bone marrow that's not producing red blood cells will instead become what we call yellow marrow and be important in the storage of adipose. Speaking of storage, we are also going to store some important minerals, particularly calcium and phosphate. We'll look at how important those are in creating the actual structure of these bones, but really they're also, the bones are this storage reservoir if we're low in calcium or phosphate, and calcium is extremely important in muscular contraction. Phosphate's important in lots of places, DNA, cell membranes, ATP, adenosine triphosphate, right? And so the bones are serving as this storage place for those important minerals. Okay. So again, most of what the naming of the bones and their different processes is going to take place in lab, but I do want to point out a few things, and these might help you there as well. Okay? So typically when we talk about bones, what we think of are these long bones. Here we're pointing out the humerus, but maybe something like the femur, right? A bone that is longer than it is wide. It's kind of our typical bone. And that's what we'll use when we talk about bone growth and development, right? But there's also plenty of bones in the body that are shaped more like little cubes. We call those short bones, or have very odd shapes like the vertebrae here, and those are irregular bones. We also have some bones that maybe get unique names because of where they're located. This is a sesamoid bone. This is your patella or your kneecap. And a sesamoid bone is one that's completely embedded in a tendon. So typically we think of bone contacting bone and creating this articulation. And absolutely there is contact with both the femur and the tibia, but this is a unique bone in that it's really laid in that quadriceps tendons. You have a couple other examples of sesamoid bones in the body as well. Sutural bones, you've started looking at the skull already, the sutures that kind of attach things like your parietal bone, and this looks like the occipital bone. Here in that suture we see a little bone embedded in there. Those vary a little bit person to person. You don't always find sutural bones. When you're looking at the skull, you are, however, looking at flat bones, right? Very thin. That is a very different looking bone than all of these other ones. We'll talk about flat bones as well. They develop slightly differently than our long bones. Okay. Figure 6.2 is your friend. All of the terminology in this table is going to be extremely helpful in understanding what you're trying to learn in lab, right? You are memorizing a vast deal of information about the skeleton in your lab, And there's all this terminology that's a little weird, right? So the greater trochanter, or the lesser tubercle, or the internal acoustic meatus. And if you don't know what some of the words mean, it's going to be really hard to apply that anywhere. So let me just run through this real quick. If you know this, go ahead and fast forward through here, but if it helps to hear me actually saying these terms, play along then, right? So sinuses, you get these hollow chambers in some bones, particularly in the skull, right? If you think about sinus pressure or a sinus infection, it's just an infection filling in this air-filled cavity. Foramen is a term for a hole, a passageway, a blood vessel, nerve, something like that is going to pass through this hole. A fissure, here they're showing in the eye this deep, this slit. So the superior orbital fissure is what they're pointing to there. Meatus, this is another term very similar to foramen. This is a passage or channel. You'll see that internal, external, acoustic meatus. And again, a canal, not that dissimilar. And this frustrates some people that foramen, meatus, canal, all kind of have similar meanings. You'll see the carotid canal, and if you look in there, there's an actual tunnel, right? So a foramen tends to be much more just a hole, right, and something passes through, but the carotid canal, the carotid artery goes through there, right? A variety of different processes. How's that for the technical term? Process. There's a bump on something. Zygomatic process, right, making up part of your cheekbone. A ramus is like a little arm, so here it's going to be something that's facing a different direction than most of the bone. So the mandible has a body, and then it has a ramus, an arm, on each side, right? See how if you don't even kind of get what a foramen is, you've got 8 or 10, I believe, that you have to know. You're always going to be like, what is that? Okay, so we'll run through here as well. Trochanter, a large, rough projection. We see a trochanter only on the femur. We get something similar on the humerus, but it's much smaller. It's a rounded projection that we call a tubercle. So you have 2 tubercles on the humerus, you have a trochanter on the hip. I don't care, like if it helps you think of a horse cantering, right, with their legs, right, whatever you need to do to get that kind of stuck in your mind. A head. So the head of the humerus here, check out this terminology, an expanded articular end of an epiphysis. It's a rounded part of a joint, right, and it has a narrowing underneath it, which we call a neck. Just like you have a round projection with a narrowing underneath it, right? So a head and a neck. Your iliac crest, you can feel it's kind of where, well, I guess it depends on fashion, where your waistline is, right? But this prominent ridge on your hip is the iliac crest. We have a couple different spines that we'll find on the pelvic girdle, these kind of prominent ridges, as opposed to not sticking out so much, just a low ridge. We would call that a line. We talked about tubercle. There's a head and a neck on the humerus. The space between those tubercles is a narrow groove we call a sulcus, the intertubercular sulcus. A fossa is a shallow depression. Trying to think of, nope, that's AMP2 that talks about that. Fossa ovalis in the heart. Here you're going to be stuck with looking at things like the humerus. Tuberosity, a rough projection. So again, this terminology isn't that clear, right? Like how different is a trochanter from a tubercle from a tuberosity, right? Or a spine from a line, those sorts of things, right? But basically, anatomists were trying to figure out ways to describe the features that they're seeing in bone. And one of the things, oh, where's my picture? That's the one I was looking for. All of those projections and trochanters, right, and things that are sticking out Keep in mind, the reason they're there is that bone is actually very active and bone is responding to the stresses applied to it, right? And so anytime a muscle is pulling on a certain area of bone, bone is going to lay down more bone in that area of stress, right? It's trying to reinforce that. So when you see something like that big trochanter on the femur, you should realize that there's large muscular attachments there, and that's why we're getting this projection, the sticker outer on the bone, is because bone lays down along the lines of stress. Now, sometimes that's the muscle actually pulling on it, sometimes that's your weight bearing down on the muscle, but we'll look at that a little bit when we get into the physiology of muscle. Okay, overall, right, large scale gross anatomy of a bone, here we are looking at that, like I said, a long bone. This is our kind of classic example. And what we'll see with a long bone is it has this central shaft that's called a diaphysis. Okay. The ends of the bone, which tend to be a little bit enlarged on each end, is an epiphysis. Right? Together they would be the epiphyses. And then notice this little connection between them. See how there's this white line there? That is what's called the epiphyseal line. This is, during development, it's called the epiphyseal plate, and that is your growth plate. Another term sometimes you'll see for that is metaphysis. Though I'll warn you, I typically just say epiphyseal line, epiphyseal plate while it's still growing. Okay, so that's kind of what we're looking at here with our long bone. And again, this terminology is going to be important so that when we start talking about the physiology and how this bone is growing, that you're going, okay, that's where this is taking place. Other things to notice on here. So the diaphysis is typically made out of what we call compact bone, while the epiphyses have more of this spongy bone. See if we have a zoom in here. Yep. So this spongy bone, it has all these little struts, little scaffolding, right? But the compact bone is really dense. And again, as we think about how bone is built along stress, the shaft, this diaphysis, has a lot of stress, a lot of torque on it, and that compact bone is going to be really sturdy. Other things you'll want to know, right down the center of this long bone, notice we have this cavity. The bone is actually hollow, right? This is the medullary cavity. And what they're showing you in this case is an adult bone where we no longer have red bone marrow in that medullary cavity like you would during childhood, even into adolescence. But after, once you become an adult, typically that's going to fill in primarily with adipose. It'll be a nutrient reserve. The red bone marrow then in adulthood is primarily restricted to the spongy bone, right? So to the epiphyses and to some of our flat or irregular bones. So if someone needs a bone marrow transplant, typically their donor is going to be an adult. Take samples from places like the iliac crest. You wouldn't find that bone marrow in charge of producing red blood cells in the medullary cavity. Now, following extreme blood loss, right, a traumatic accident, huge amount of blood loss, when the body goes to replace that, some of this yellow bone marrow can actually revert to red bone marrow and take up that role again. Other things that you want, let's see, this picture might be better. Lining that medullary cavity, you have a connective tissue called the endosteum. Surrounding the outside of the bone is a connective tissue called the periosteum, right? Perimeter osteum, you should think bone. It's covering the bone. And no, I pulled this picture from another book because I just love the way they show, right? It looks like you could just like peel this periosteum down the bone. Now the outer portion is much more of a connective tissue. The inside of that, the part touching the bone, is a much more kind of a cellular layer, and this is where we're going to keep stem cells that will help us actually repair this bone if something happens. I think we got all those. We got all those. Okay. Do note, right, we were talking about the spongy bone in the epiphyses. When we look at flat bones, it's a similar structure, but it's different, right? It does still have these two outer layers of compact bone, just like you see in something like the femur, but then it's filled with spongy bone in between those. And that spongy bone is very similar to what you would find in an epiphysis. Okay, so let's keep going, thinking about what bone is actually made up of. Now remember, we said bone is osseous connective tissue. And if you think back to connective tissue, one of the things that we said makes it really unique and actually really useful is the fact that it has very few cells and is primarily matrix. Now, we'll talk about these different types of cells. They're obviously important in how bone functions, but keep in mind that the matrix, that non-cellular portion, is actually going to be what we're primarily talking about with bone. Now, the matrix in bone is made up of two main components. The organic components are collagen fibers. So some of our cells are actually sitting there producing these collagen, these protein fibers. Remember, they don't have a ton of stretch, but they are really, really strong. Those same cells then, once the collagen fibers are built, they're actually going to create an environment that's conducive for calcium phosphate to precipitate, to harden, to coat all of these collagen fibers. We call this calcium phosphate mixture hydroxyapatite. I know. Who comes up with these names? Hydroxyapatite is this calcium phosphate. And the thing I tend to think about here is, did you ever make this with rock candy? You had like a string and you would dip it into a sugar water and let it dry and dip it, right? And you'd eventually think of that the same way. These collagen fibers are like that string, and what the cells set up is this super saturated environment where your rock candy, it was sugar water. Here we have calcium phosphate in mixture, but it's going to do the same thing. It's going to solidify, it's going to harden around those collagen fibers, right? And that's what gives us actual strong bones, this combination of this really tough protein and then this hard inorganic calcium phosphate. Okay, this is what the cells look like. Now here's the picture out of your book. I like this one just a little better because it tries to connect and show you that we really have two kind of different lineages of cells here. Okay, so these osteogenic cells, these are the stem cells, right? These are ones I was talking about in that periosteum. You would find, right, genesis, origin of bone cells, stem cells. These stem cells are going to be able to convert in different times of their life into what we call osteoblasts. Remember in the tissue chapter we talk about that blast ending, meaning an immature cell that is actively producing matrix, right? So these are the cells that are just cranking out the collagen that's going to form the foundation of bone. When that cell has built enough collagen and helped it solidify, it gets trapped, right? It basically walls itself into a little chamber and then it sits there. So we change its name to an osteocyte, right? Cyte means cell, osteo is still bone. This is that mature cell that's really kind of inactive. It's sitting there. Now, the cool thing about these cells in bones is if you break a cell, you actually crack open that little chamber that the osteocyte is sitting in, and it now can revert to an osteoblast. It can start building collagen fibers and setting up bone. That's how we're going to repair damaged bone. So we'll look at that some more in the physiology. Now, this other lineage of cells, so I will say, right, on this side, blast, I think bone builders. Blast, bone builders. They're the ones making more bone. In this lineage, we have osteoclasts. These are the bone chompers. They're actually going to tear the bone apart, which sounds bad, but let's not rush to judgment on them yet. So here, what we see is this really interesting cell. It's actually more related to monocytes, right, to white blood cells. We talked about some monocytes becoming, we do that in A&P too, sorry, monocytes becoming macrophages, right, white blood cells that protect you from invading microbes. In this case, these kind of precursors, these stem cells, right, to those same white blood cells fuse together. Notice this is a multinucleate cell, and they are, doesn't he kind of look like a scrubbing bubble? I think of them as the scrubbing bubbles. And they work their way around on the bone. Notice this ruffled border they're pointing out. This is for surface area, and what we're going to see is that these osteoclasts produce a bunch of enzymes, right? So they're pointing out the lysosomes. This is housing the enzymes. They move to that ruffled border, and they're actually going to digest the bone. Chompers, right? These osteoclasts break down bone for important reasons, right? It allows them to release that calcium and phosphate that might be needed by other systems in the body. And it also releases that calcium and phosphate for osteoblasts that are still active to use to create new bone. And so in our skeleton all the time, we're looking for this balance of osteoclasts, right, chomping, clearing out parts of bone, while osteoblasts keep building fresh bone, and we call that remodeling. This goes on throughout your life, and it's part of what allows your bones to adapt to their circumstances. It allows us to build bone where it's needed, right, along those lines of stress, but not carry excess bone if it's not being utilized.